Hello and welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. I would like to thank everyone who has donated to the show. Your contributions help us make the show sustainable. When you're ready to launch your next project, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so you should check out Linode at linode.com/podcastinit and get a $20 credit to try out their fast and reliable Linux virtual servers for running your next app. You'll also want to make sure that your users don't have to put up with bugs, so you should use Rollbar for tracking and aggregating your application errors to find and fix the bugs in your application before your users notice they exist. Use the link rollbar.com/podcastinit to get 90 days and 300,000 errors tracked for free on their Bootstrap plan. You can also visit our site to subscribe to the show, sign up for the newsletter, read the show notes, and get in touch at pythonpodcast.com. To help other people find the show, you can leave a review on iTunes or Google Play Music and tell your friends and coworkers. We also have a discourse forum where you can find out about upcoming guests, suggest questions, and propose show ideas. Your host as usual is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Eric Steele about the Plone CMS project. So Eric, could you please introduce yourself?
So hi, I'm Eric Steele. I am the release manager for Plone.
So how did you first get introduced to Python?
My first introduction, I was working at Penn State University, and we were looking to build out a website and a web application. And my coworker introduced me to this project called Zope, and we used that for a few months, and I hated it completely. And so we switched to Cold Fusion. But I came back a few years later with Plone for a personal project and just kind of really fell in love with Plone, the software, but also Python, the language. And I've been with it ever since.
So can you start off by explaining a bit about what Plone is and how you got involved with it?
Plone is a content management system, open source, Python-based. The way I explain it to my mom is it's basically a blog on steroids. And yeah, if you're building a website, an intranet, or a corporate outward-facing site where you have a lot of content editors, where security is a major concern, where accessibility is something you're deeply involved in, and multilingual content is important to you, then Plone is really where you want to be.
And how did you first get involved with the project?
Let's see. I started using Plone on my own in 2004. Let's see. I made my first commit to Plone core in 2007 or so, and that was rejected pretty much immediately. But a couple years later, I was approached and asked to take over as release manager. And so I joined on, became the release manager for the Plone 4 release, which came out in 2010, I believe. And I've stuck on ever since.
Given that you joined in a little later, are you familiar with the story of how the project got started, and wondering if you can share a bit too about how it's managed to evolve over the years?
Yeah, sure. So Plone initially started as basically a theme and usability layer on top of the Zope application server back in 1999, I believe. And that was Alan Runyon and Alexander Leamy were involved in that. And yeah, so they kind of sat down and started building this add-on product to Zope that eventually evolved into this entire application. Alan was more than happy to really take on the code-based tasks, and Alex really kind of took on the community side of things. And they've mostly moved on since then, but the community has grown and has gotten so strong that they've really been able to succeed without them, which is, I think, one of the really interesting parts, for me at least. The first public release came in 2001, so it's 15 years old this year, and which is for any software project, an open source project, is I think pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it's definitely pretty uncommon to come across, as you mentioned, particularly open source projects that have been able to stick around for that long. I mean, there are, of course, notable exceptions like a number of the languages that we use and things like the Linux project, but for end user applications, the fact that it's been around for 15 years and has been able to actually stay relevant within that time frame is definitely an impressive feat.
Yeah, we're excited about that.
So you mentioned too a bit about the community, so I'm just curious about sort of how that community has evolved over time, and I guess what are some of the methods that you've used to make sure that the people stay engaged with Plone as newer offerings have come available.
Right. In the past few years, we've spent a lot of time talking about where Plone will be in the next 5-10 years, particularly as we come up on this birthday of ours. And we sat down and started really looking at, what are the strengths of Plone? And as developers, we kind of really want to focus on the code, but the thing that came out from basically every single person submitting that was that the community was the strongest aspect of this software system. And that's really started from the beginning. Zope kind of really brought this idea of the code sprint into the software community. And that's not just in the agile sense, but in the get a bunch of developers or documentation writers into the same room together at the same time and get them working on a single project over a few days. And we've used that as a way to not just bring the software project forward, but also to kind of build this culture where we have stories from our early days that are still being told today about this crazy thing that happened. We have an Austrian prince who is on and off developer, and he's hosted sprints at his family's castle. There's a story of working on an archipelago where they had to literally commit all their stuff to a local server, pick it up, and then carry it to the other side of a hill to hook up to a different thing so they can get it off-site and backed up to the central SVN. And we've used that gathering as a way to really perpetuate the culture of the community. When I first started, Alex Leamy said to me that, we want to meet you and make sure you're not crazy. And it makes it a lot easier to work with people in a distributed project when you know them, when, if I get into a shouting match with somebody over email, we know it's not personal because we've met and it's much easier to, kind of forgive and move on and find common ground as far as the code goes.
Yeah, that's definitely an important point to emphasize, is that particularly as open source becomes more widespread, it's more often the case that the people who are working on a project might be, located on opposite ends of the planet and have never interacted with each other outside of the issue tracker on the project's, GitHub page. So having that shared community of people who have actually been in one location, worked on the code together, shared other experiences other than simply swapping bits, definitely helps maintain the strength of the community. One of the guests who we had on a show a while ago, there were, I think, 4 or 5 of them, and the first time that they had ever actually even been on a voice conversation together was to be interviewed for this podcast.
Oh, wow.
And outside of that, the only time that they had ever interacted was via email and issue trackers.
Yeah. We've actually, in the past few years, started up a program of designating strategic sprints. And that was originally meant to be for stuff that we saw as extremely valuable to the software. But then we expanded the idea to also include getting specific people to sprints. So, for example, we have a small community in South Africa, and because they're so geographically not near the rest of us, most of them weren't able to get to the conferences and that sort of thing. And we use that strategic sprint funding to send a few of us down there to meet with them, work for a few days, kind of get them spun up and working in Plone core. And I mean, the response from those programs have been amazing.
Yeah, it's definitely a great thing to hear, because given that a lot of us spend a good portion of our time, working deep in the guts of some piece of code and figuring out how that interacts with networks and computers, it's often easy to forget the fact that the purpose of the code is actually for humans, and trying to consider what are the human impacts of this, and what are the human factors of all the other people who have put their time and energy into it. And then particularly when dealing with, for instance, submitting a bug report as an end user of the project and feeling that sense of entitlement that just because this software was made available to you, that means that whoever's on the other end of it is going to take your bug report and, thank you for it, and then be expected to put in more of their time and energy just because they've done it in the past. So being able to ensure that there is that human face to it within the community helps to alleviate that and just contribute the basis where you can assume that when somebody's interacting with you, that they're doing it with the best intentions, as opposed to assuming the worst because of the fact that it's difficult to maintain the humanizing factors through such asynchronous and impersonal communication channels.
Really, the thing I find most fascinating about it is that we've had, people move on from the project. They, go get a job at a different company where they're not doing Plone in their day-to-day work. But we've found they tend to come back. I mean, we joke that Plone is a drinking game with an API. And we've only recently gotten the API part, but we've had a lot of people who've left and then come back to our conferences when they're in a nearby city, or to sprints when they're nearby. And it's been really fascinating for me because they'll say, I haven't done Plone in 3 years, and I don't really want to dive back deep into the code, but I've been doing this thing over here, and it's similar to, I think I can solve a problem that you're having that's not part of your core product. So we've had people, help out with the JavaScript layer. We recently did a huge rewrite of our JavaScript layer, and part of that comes from a person who left and then came back with some really great ideas for us. Our continuous integration infrastructure has come from a lot of that as well. And we've had a lot of, just great things where people who've left come back with, they've grown up elsewhere and come back and really helped us out because they still want to hang out with us.
That's great. So aside from the community, what are some of the things that make Plone unique among some of the other myriad CMS tools that are available? And also, I'm curious, which of the other CMS tools you consider to be direct competitors?
Yeah, I mean, the things we really try to hammer into the core product are really strong security. Content workflow goes along with that. We also really try to focus on accessibility and multilingual content. And those are typically the things we try to really, they're not always our main focus, but they're the things we always try to keep in mind as we add new features. I think Plone really shines in that it comes as a ready to use website right out of the box. A lot of the systems we tend to go up against they're a lot thinner out of the box, but then you have to add a lot of add-ons, and that brings in all kinds of security complications. As far as competitors, our marketing guys will yell at me. In the US, we typically wind up going up against Drupal and sometimes SharePoint. I think SharePoint's probably a lot more analogous to what we do, but when you say I want an open source CMS, it tends to be Drupal or WordPress are the ones that kind of come to mind here. I know in Europe, Typo 3 is another one that people bring up quite a bit.
And you mentioned the track record of security and that it's a strong focus of the project. I'm wondering, what are some of the key features of Plone and the way that it's built that have enabled you to maintain that level of security as the project continues to grow and evolve?
Yeah, we're proud to say we've never had a 0-day vulnerability. We really focus on security as a process and start from the design of the project. Yeah, a lot of that starts at the ZOAP level. The way the ZOAP database is set up, it's not SQL based, so there's no SQL injection to begin with, which is a huge vector. And the way ZOAP is set up, the security is really built into the infrastructure. Each object in the database has access checks, and both at the object and the attribute level. We also run something called restricted Python that prevents code written in scripts to do anything particularly nasty. Yeah. So, and because of that, executing code doesn't really have the ability to patch itself. You can't install add-ons through the web, which is, it's something that we've had people ask us, I'd really love the ability to do this, but we really try to avoid that because there's scary bits of code that you can pick up on the internet and shove into a site that can cause problems. And I guess the other thing to add is we recently added a CSRF protection at the database level that prevents any sort of right to the database without an access token. Between the CSRF protection and the not having SQL injection vulnerabilities, it really cuts out a large portion of the available vectors. And our security team is really active at both testing and patching. We've really ramped up the amount of testing and patching we do recently, the past few years. We've put out more hot fixes, but nothing has been in the wild. It's all been stuff that's been either discovered by the security team themselves or disclosed to us, and we've fixed before it's been pushed out there to the world.
And you mentioned that one of the layers that helps enable that level of security is the fact that it uses the ZOP object database as the default backend. So I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit about what the ZOP object database looks like for people who are more familiar with a relational database, and wondering if you can also describe some of the benefits and drawbacks in comparison with the traditional sort of Postgres or MySQL style database that people are used to.
Yeah, the ZODB is really the thing that kind of takes new Plone developers the longest to get their heads around. It's an object-oriented database. So the data you're looking at this is going to be obvious, but objects. The ZODB is really storing data objects just like they were in memory. So really the biggest difference between that and a relational database is the developer doesn't need to do any sort of triggering to load or save the object. You just get the object, you modify it, and it acts like it was just a regular Python object in RAM. As far as structurally, the ZODB is very hierarchical. So instead of storing everything in a flat table, everything lives within something else. So we have a Plone site as the root, and you can have pages within that or folders within that contain pages. And because of that structure, we get inheritance, and then you can apply security to that as well. So where you say the folder has these permissions set, then everything underneath that will inherit that as well. So we don't need to apply security specifically to each object we have. We can get that from above. Yeah, you really, I guess, never have to think about your database. Like I said before, when you're storing content or editing content, it's just an object or a standard Python object.
And so does the ZOP object database sort of act as sort of an embedded data store in the Plone application, or is it possible to run it in somewhat of a distributed or a clustered fashion?
Yeah. So using something called Zio, you can distribute it. And then there's also, so you can basically have several ZOP front ends talking to a single Zio backend. And then you can also use Zio replication service, which will basically allow you to make clones of that. So as far as drawbacks go, yeah, like I said, there's, you really have to train your mind to think in the object-oriented way rather than relational way. So people coming from a SQL background tend to take a while to really grasp what's going on. If you use SQL Alchemy, it feels very similar to that. But anyone who's coming from an object-oriented background obviously will pick it up pretty quickly. And if you're doing strongly structured data, that's really what relational databases are for.
So would it be fair to say that you could kind of think of the way that data is structured in the ZODB similar to how one would use similar to a document database such as CouchDB or MongoDB?
Yes, absolutely.
There's definitely a bit of a impedance mismatch when people are trying to think about document stores in the same way that they think of relational databases. So it sounds that there's a similar hurdle to overcome when you're getting started with the ZOP object database because of the way that you do have to rethink how you model your objects and how they relate to each other.
Right. Yeah, it was, I believe, the original NoSQL database back before it was called NoSQL. We're hipster.
So as you mentioned earlier, Plone is a fairly long-lived project, and it's certainly one of the most long-lived Python projects that I'm aware of. I'm wondering, what are some of the most difficult maintenance challenges that you guys have encountered over the years of its existence?
Oh boy. Right now, the main thing is there's a lot of old code. Like I said, we've had a lot of people in there working on the project who've moved on. So some of it's just old because we're 15 years old. Some of it's old because it's not maintained because the person moved on. And we're really right now trying to go through quite a bit of a refresh of the code base, cleaning up a lot of the features that aren't used, and in some cases trying to renew the features that aren't used as much as they should be, but really are something we want to make work for everyone. Recently, we have a thing called content rules, which allow you to do actions based on, if a workflow state changes or a comment is added or something happens with a piece of content, and basically allows you to set up a set of, if this happens, then do this automatically. And we found that people weren't using it, but it's all there. It works really well. It just really didn't make sense to the end users. So we spent a lot of time kind of rethinking how that flow works, and released that recently, and it's been a lot more successful now. But yeah, there's a lot of dead code in there, and we've gone through recently and done a lot of work to clean that up. As far as that goes, one of the biggest issues we have right now is, if you look at the structure of the application itself, there's Zope on the bottom, Zope 2 on the bottom. And then there's a project called CMF, the content management framework, in between. And then Plone sits on top of that. And then each of our users tends to build applications based on the Plone layer. So it's, 3-4 layers deep right now. So CMF is not really being actively maintained. So we're in the process of trying to fold a lot of that code into Plone itself and getting rid of the bits that we don't use. Zope 2 is a political issue, I'll say it that way. But there's not a lot of activity happening there either. So we are in the process of trying to take that and modernize it ourselves. And so there's a lot of our stack that we're kind of the last one left using these two major projects underneath us. And we're trying to take them over and kind of make them part of Plone itself, so that instead of being based on these other technologies, Plone is just based on Plone. And so far that's going surprisingly well. So yeah, we have a lot of packages. I think our last release, between the Plone's open CMF layers, we have 300 some packages we track, and the bulk of those are at the Plone layer. And so, as release manager, that's falls on me to make sure that every one of those has a package release, and a version pin, and it gets to be really problematic. Part of the issue for me is that if I sit down and start making a release, by the time I've gotten through the 30 packages that need to be released for that whole Plone release, somebody's already gone through and made changes to one of the first ones I've released. It's a great problem to have, that it's so active, but it's hard for me to keep up. So we've kind of been trying to find ways to automate that and bring more people in to help with that. In recent years, we spent a lot of time working with, most of our developers are Python developers. And when you have them do JavaScript, they code JavaScript like Python developers, which isn't a bad thing, but the world is changing as far as JavaScript goes. And so we've been trying to do a lot of work to really modernize that, to get a JavaScript layer that is testable, which for me is huge, because I have nightmares about releasing broken, a Plone release with a broken text editor, because that pretty much makes the entire thing useless. So we've done a lot of work to really modernize that JavaScript stack, trying to bring in some people who are pure JavaScript developers to really get involved in that as well.
And I'm sure that given the age of the project, Python 3 has not been very kind to the people who are trying to bring Plone into the modern age.
Right, yeah. Python 3 is definitely something we've spent a lot of time talking about, and we've kind of decided we can't do a thing about it until we take care of the Zope and CMF layers. Zope is nearly there, I believe. There are a few packages left that, unfortunately, they're the biggest and kind of hairiest ones to deal with. But we have some people working on that now. So I think once those are brought into the future, we can move Plone there as well. So I think we're within, a few years of having that happen. I'm really excited to see that happen. Yeah, speaking of Python 3, reminded me that one of the weirdest things about being around so long is that Plone and Zope were developing things before it was in Python core. So we have our own datetime library, which precedes the Python core datetime library. And so we've been trying to, move everything off of that to become more Pythonic, because what we were doing made, there wasn't a Pythonic way when we built it. And now there is. So we kind of have to backtrack and modernize again.
So another one of the major tenets of the project is the fact that there are a lot of extensions available to install to add various functionality to the project. So I'm wondering what that plugin system looks like at an architectural level, and then followed on with what are some of the most interesting plugins that you are aware of.
Oh boy. Okay. So that's hard to describe. So we've recently, in the past 3-4 years, have added a real actual API called Plone.api, which was not particularly inventive, but highly descriptive. And yeah, so that's right now really where we're trying to push people to interact, to do things, adding, installing packages, for doing any sort of interaction with the core and the database. We're trying to push people through that way. We also use something, I believe it's from Zope, called generic setup, which is an XML-based structure for defining settings for the most part. And we use that. It gives us the ability to handle installation and upgrades, so changes between each release of an add-on. I hope that answers that fairly well. As far as popular add-ons, there's quite a few. I'm trying to think of, since we released Plone 5 last year, so it's taking a few years. It'll take a couple years for everyone to catch up with a lot of the add-ons. One of the biggest has always been something called Plone Form Gen, which allowed people to go in and add forms easily through the web. And I use the phrase through the web, and it's something that's been really big within Plone. And people keep reminding me that it doesn't really exist outside. Plone has this long-standing setup of being able to go in and, whether it's through Plone or Zope, and, add a new page template, add a new Python script, and do it all through your browser. And at times it's been clunky, and I think we've really gotten back to it now where it's been a lot easier. But just being able to do everything right there in the browser without having to go to the file system has been really great for adoption and makes the customization story a lot easier. Back to Plone Form Gen. It really gives people the ability to create forms, whether it's just like a mailer or writing to a SQL database, that sort of thing. And that's actually one of the first things I helped out on in the community. But that's been rewritten now. It'll be called Easy Form, but it'll work the same way. One of the things we're most excited about right now is something called Mosaic, which is a drag and drop content layout system. It's been something we've been trying to do for years and just kind of kept running into browser issues, where, IE 6 and 7 and 8 each had different issues that couldn't be addressed in a way that we could work out. But we finally got something that's really working well. I'm fairly sure this is going to go in Plone Core very soon. Rapido is another huge one right now, which is another one of those through the web customization packages. Really makes it easier for people to do that sort of business logic through the web, straight through the Plone interface. We've also had a lot of work recently, a number of distributions cropping up. We've tried this in the past with, like a Plone for Education distribution, and we've just kind of not really taken off. But the past year or so, we've had one called Castle CMS, which adds a lot of editing abilities on top of it, as well as content layouts. There's one called Plumi, which is mainly for video sharing sites. There's what's it called? Bika for managing labs and health centers. And another called Quave, which was previously known as Plone Intranet, which is purely focused around building a really strong intranet project.
And one of my early experiences of interacting with Plone was actually as a systems administrator trying to upgrade, I think it was version 2 up through version 4. And so I'm curious what the typical upgrade story looks like and how that might be complicated by the existence of some of these various plugins.
Yeah, we've always taken our upgrade story very seriously. Plone is fairly unique in that we have always tried to make sure that your data comes along with you as you upgrade. We've seen some of the other systems out there say, you're on your own. We've always tried to provide a way to at the very least, get the data from one version to the next. Plone.org was built on one of the early alphas originally, like 0.1 alpha to something like that. And the data on that had been brought through up until last year when we finally decided, there have been 1,000 people in here poking at this. We need to really just clean it out and start over. But so we really do try to take the upgrade story seriously. One of the major mistakes we've made in the past, with Plone 3, we made a lot of changes. And not all for the best. It was a needed release. So we made a lot of changes kind of based around the idea that, things needed to be repeatable as far as coding and customization goes. We were doing a lot of work that was really for kind of solidifying the product for developers. But at the same time, it really made it difficult for the integrators, the administrators who were doing the upgrades, because we broke a lot of stuff. There were quite a few add-ons that needed substantial work to be rewritten. Everybody's themes broke, that sort of thing. It was not a good time for us, and definitely not a good time for the people who were doing the upgrades. And so we apologize profusely. And in the past few releases, Plone 4 and Plone 5, we tried to really minimize the amount of breakage we've put in there. Things still have to change, but we've tried to provide a very clear path. Here's what's breaking. Here's what you need to do. Provide deprecation warnings and links to documentation about how, when something breaks, here's the page you need to go to read how to fix it, and that sort of thing. Yeah, it was it was a really interesting time for us, and not just from the upgrade point of view, but also because it broke. I talked about the through the web customization. It broke a lot of that because as developers, we were trying to say, we're trying to save you from yourself. You're making all these changes directly through the web interface, directly to the database. You should really be doing this on the file system where you can commit it to SVN or Git or whatever. And that didn't go over well because we were, everything you've been doing for years is wrong. And it was a major, for many reasons, it was a major problem for us. Really turned a lot of people off to the software, and we've spent the last few years trying to kind of atone for that.
You've sort of touched on it a little bit over the course of our conversation, but I'm wondering if you can address what kinds of projects Plone is best suited for.
It's very strong for an intranet. It's got the collaboration abilities, the workflow, the ability to share content and comment on it, that sort of thing, and all the document management as well. The frustrating thing about being an open source project that's good for intranets is that you never know who's using your software because they download it and put it behind a firewall and you never hear about it. Every year I find somebody new who's using it, and it's been amazing. Just like, oh, I didn't know that. So we're really liked for intranets. If you've got a big company that wants to run all of your outward-facing content through content editors or through a vice president in charge of something or other, our workflow abilities are really strong for that. If you have a site that you're really worried about security, we're very good for that. I'm not sure I'm allowed to say it, but we run the FBI.gov and I believe NSA sites, as well as several other large government sites in other countries.
Another one worth calling out is actually the MIT OpenCourseware site. I actually work for MIT and in the same office as the people who are managing that project, so I've spoken to them a few times about their use of Plone.
Excellent, yeah.
So you mentioned the workflow. I'm wondering what a typical interaction looks like for somebody who's trying to publish content on a Plone site.
Yeah. So Plone has always tried to make sure that you're interacting with the content object you're looking at. So I know a lot of other systems will send you to a separate editing site to manage the content. In Plone, when you're logged in, you go to, you navigate through the content because it's got that hierarchical structure. You go through the folders to the content object you're looking for, to the document, to the news item, to the event, and you click the edit button, and it flips you over to a form that allows you to edit that right in line. And because of the security's there, if you don't have access to that, you don't see the buttons, you don't see any of the, we can prevent you from seeing certain fields, from seeing certain objects altogether.
And I'm assuming that there's a method for people who prefer to work in their text editors for being able to create their content locally and then upload it to the site after the fact.
Yes. There are some external editors that work like that. And there are different ways of mounting the ZODB. We have a guy who's built some really interesting stuff, allowing you to mount a Dropbox share or any other kind of site, Google Docs, that sort of thing, directly into your Plone site, so you can work on stuff from that's living in your Dropbox and it'll show up live on your site.
So, what are some of the most interesting uses of Plone that you've seen?
Yeah, well, I should mention the Brazilian Olympics site ran Plone, so that was one of our big hits from this year. Managed to hold up to that strain very easily. Although I'm sure Hector, if he's listening, will correct me on how easy that was. Yeah, we have, let's see, I mentioned a bunch of government agencies. We have a lot of universities using it as well. I've always been fascinated. So Plone is owned by Plone, the software is owned by a foundation, and our foundation's president works for the Clean Clothes campaign, and he's been doing some really interesting things working with labor unions starting up in countries, and he's basically been providing intranets on a USB stick that can just be plugged in somewhere and fired up. And, if it gets discovered, they just pop a new one in somewhere else. And just to allow these groups to self-organize in a very secure and private way. And I've always found that just really fascinating from many levels.
And what are some of the biggest challenges facing the Plone project and the community as development and deployment paradigms continue to change?
Yeah. Like I said, we're working doing a lot more front end focused work right now, and a lot of Plone's core developers have been around for a while, and some of them are very in the get off my lawn JavaScript mentality. So we're trying to push back against that a bit, but we're making solid progress there. I mentioned what we're trying to do with Zope, getting it Python 3 ready and cleaning up the stack. While we're approaching the Zope cleanup from that direction, we're also looking at the idea of the headless CMS. And that's the idea of having just a content serving backend that responds to REST API calls. Looking very seriously at that, it's going surprisingly well. We met in Barcelona back in May, I believe, and sat down and decided, let's just throw out everything and start with, we'll take the ZODB as our database layer. We'll use the Zope toolkit, which is part of the Zope stack, and Dexterity, which is our newer way of defining content objects. And, just those 3 layers, put them together, see what happens. And we were able to, within a week, come up with a working prototype that, stores content, spits it back out again, and it's really, really fast. Asynchronous, runs in Python 3. So we're really excited to see where that's going. So I think we've got these 2 concurrent projects of working on cleaning up our stack. One is taking what we have and removing the bits we don't want, and the other is throwing everything out and then adding stuff back in. And so I will probably see those meet somewhere in the middle, and I'm excited to see what that looks like. One of the other really interesting things for me, being around so long, is that it's weird being an old software project, because in some ways that makes you venerable, but it also makes you ancient, which I guess probably isn't the best way of putting it. People look at the software and say Plone is 15 years old. It's ancient and, antiquated, and that really ignores the fact that we've been modernizing all this time, and it's constantly growing. I talked last year about this idea of my grandfather's axe, which is this idea of this is my grandfather's axe, and I've replaced the head when it chipped, and I gave it a new handle, but it's still the very same axe my grandfather used. And I kind of look at Plone the same way, where we've been, it's still Plone the software project, but we've been ripping out and rebuilding, and it's still Plone, but it's brand new again. Yeah.
That's definitely a great metaphor, and there's definitely a strong bias for everything that's new when we're dealing with software development, not taking into account the fact that most of the tools and principles that we're using are, fairly well worn. For instance, Python, a lot of people don't realize, has been around since the early 90s, and yet it's still managing to add new features and push the forefront in a lot of language development paradigms. And, Linux is upwards of 20 years old, and it's still powering the majority of computing devices that people interact with. So
absolutely, yeah,
it's easy to lose track of what we can still learn from old software.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's hard sometimes not to be, the old guy shouting at kids that, their rock music's too loud. But when you've been around for a long time, you've made mistakes and you've learned from them. And to see others making those same mistakes, you kind of, you just want to, you kind of want to shake people. But yeah, we do our best to try to get those warnings out there. Hopefully people listen.
So are there any other topics that you think we should cover before we close out?
Yeah, nothing's immediately coming to mind. I mean, I'm happy to talk more community stuff, but I mean, not everybody gets into that as much as I do.
If you want to talk more about the community, that's definitely a great subject to cover.
Okay. Yeah. So I mentioned, I've been with the project for, 8 to 10 years now. And around the same time, I mentioned, Plone 3 happened, and there was a kind of exodus of both users and developers. And it was kind of this really weird time for us. Alan, our one founder, has always been kind of, has always kind of stood back from the project. He's much more happy to just code and hang out with us. And Alex was always the more involved one as far as organizing the community goes. And he, moved on to a new job and, kind of just had less and less time to work with us. And, we were seeing that from a lot of people. And it really, for a while there, felt like the project was dying. And there were a few of us that were sitting around talking and realizing that, somebody should do something. And then kind of like, oh, I guess that's me. And I got really fascinated by this idea. There's a book I read called Open Advice, which was put out. It's a collection of articles by people who've worked with a number of open source projects. And I read an article in there, and I wish I could remember the name, but it was about this idea of generational turnover in open source projects. And I'd never realized this was a thing. I just, figured, people stay around forever, and, it's a big, shiny, happy place. And it really opened my eyes that, people move on from software projects, and it's okay. And, it's talked about, I believe it was Debian, where, the average contributor is there for 7 years, I think, but between when they make their first commit and their final one. It kind of follows a bell curve, and, whether they start out slowly and get it really involved, and then slowly taper off and sort of just disappear at the end. And So yeah, we've had this we had this really major turnover in our contributors, and it was a weird time. It's one of the reasons I've been I've stayed on. In the past, we've changed out release managers with every major release, and it's kind of the reason I've stuck on through Plone 4 and Plone 5, just to kind of provide that continuity while we got back up and running again. But yeah, it's been a fascinating thing for me to watch and participate in. Just seeing new people come in who weren't there when the old ones that were there, most of them are younger than me, but seeing people come in who have no idea, who they've never met the people who founded the project, and a lot of the people who were there at the beginning, because they've come in well after the others have left. But we've found with this kind of very strong culture, and with our sprints, we have that continuity of culture. We have that ability to bring people in, kind of bring them into the fold, tell them all our old crazy war stories, and they buy in very quickly, and make new stories that are of their own. And yeah, it's been fun and scary, and yeah, it's been great.
It's a great story. Was there anything else that you wanted to cover?
No, I think that's it.
Great. So for anybody who wants to keep in touch with you and follow what you're up to, and follow updates to the Plone project, what are the best ways for them to do that?
If you want to follow the Plone project, you can go to plone.org, which is our community site. We have a discourse board there you can join and get involved with. We're also on Freenode, #Plone. And if you want to contact me, I'm eSteele at plone.org, or just eSteele on Twitter. Happy to answer any questions you have.
So with that, I will move us into the picks. For my pick today, I'm going to choose the Inquiry podcast. So it's just a show where they pick a particular topic in the news, and then they will do a little bit of investigative reporting on it. And they're usually broken down into 3 parts, where they have sort of the setup to the story, the middle of it, and then a follow-on. And it's been pretty interesting. They've got some good topics and good coverage of it. And then for my next pick, I'm going to choose the PyCon US and the PSF, because they have graciously agreed to contribute a sponsor booth for all of the Python podcasts. So if you make it out to PyCon US in Portland, Oregon next year, I will be there along with Michael Kennedy from Talk Python to Me, and Brian Ocken of Test and Code podcast, as well as the gentleman behind the Partially Derivative podcast. So if you're there, come say hi, find us. I'd be happy to chat. And with that, I will pass it to you, Eric. What have you got for us?
Yeah, so the first one I wanted to mention is a game I downloaded this week called Really Bad Chess. It's I have it on my iPhone. I think there's an Android one available, but it is basically I love chess, but it gets boring because there's one way to play. There's a set of moves you make, and Really Bad Chess basically shakes that up by giving you 8 knights or 6 queens, that sort of thing, and will actually change the mix it gives you as you get better at the game. And it's just kept it really fresh and really interesting for me. And the other thing I wanted to mention is Home Assistant, which is another Python project. Have you talked to them yet?
I have not.
You should. They're very
definitely
fascinating. It's home automation software, or server, and I've been for years really wanting to geek out on my home, and this has really given me the ability to do so. Set up all kinds of rules so that when I get home, these lights turn on if it's after if it's within 30 minutes of sunset, that sort of thing. And I've been having a lot of fun with that. Too much fun. My wife is not happy about the amount of money I spent on light bulbs, but we'll get through that.
No, it's definitely interesting. I'll have to follow up with them. I recently spoke with the CTO of the Mycroft project, so it ties into that a little bit, but I'll have to follow up and speak with the folks at Home Assistant. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to tell us all about Plone. It's a piece of software that I've been aware of for a while, but never really dug deep into. So I appreciate the background and the deep dive on the technology. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate having the chance to talk to you.